After hearing from 92 witnesses over 15 days, federal prosecutors in the Boston Marathon bombing trial today rested their case. And they closed in dramatic fashion, detailing the injuries suffered by Lingji Lu and the youngest person killed in the attacks, 8-year-old Martin Richard. WGBH's Emily Rooney and Adam Reilly were both in the courtroom for today's testimony and now join me. So, Emily, they did save the best, or I guess the worst, for last with Martin Richard, yes?
Well, they went through the autopsy of Lingji Lu, and then they introduced an FBI photographer. That was actually quite dramatic because we assumed they were going to do the medical examiners back to back. And then they took a break. And then they came back and they finished with this really detailed, as you said, gruesome testimony, talking about little Martin was eviscerated, one of his arms was almost completely severed, bones exposed, his liver, his pancreas. I mean, and interesting though, in this case, they did not ask the medical examiner how quickly did he die. They focused on that in the other two.
But they did with Lingji Lu and said that she was conscious
for about
probably as she bled out in minutes.
That's right. Yeah. And one thing they did with Martin Richard that they did not do with Lingji Lu was hold up the clothing that he'd worn when he died. And I got to say, I actually had to sort of zone out a little bit. Every trauma you could imagine his small body undergoing, it underwent. We heard about all of it, and then we saw that the clothes he was wearing. And a lot of reporters were sort of craning their necks to look at his parents and how they were reacting.
I was too.
I, at one point, sort of did a passing look. I didn't get a look at all. It felt wrong to hear these parents having their sons' moments recounted publicly like that. Just such horror.
Except they were in on that. I know that they gave permission because his were the only clothing that was shown in court. The other two, they didn't bring the clothing
in lieu of the autopsy photos being made available later.
And by the way, one piece, when the doctor was very monotone and clinical, but at one point he held up the pants and he said, I don't know whether these were long pants or short pants. The material melted. Destroyed. He said melted.
So what was the reaction of his mother and father?
During the first part of the court, when they were showing the pictures of Martin lying there dead, that was during the Lingji Lu discussion, Bill Richard did not look at the screen. There was a monitor right there with a photograph of his little boy lying right there. He shut his eyes and had his arm around Denise. But I wasn't in for the later part, so I don't know whether he was looking at the clothing.
I sort of forced myself. I felt, I don't want to belabor this, it felt inappropriate to look. I know that after the testimony was done, he looked totally shell-shocked to me. We should mention that some of the jurors were reacting very emotionally too. As they saw
what was my next thought?
What
were they?
Crying,
was their reaction?
Wiping away tears, looking like they were barely holding it together. There were several of them. I saw about three.
Excuse me, the autopsy photos were really graphic. I did not go look at them, but one of the guys I was sitting next to did. You could go upstairs and take a look at them. And he said, it was really rough. And so these jurors, I saw a lot of the jurors kind of looking away. They were looking at these photographs, but didn't want to look at them for long.
Were any of Lingji Lu's family there? Have they been there throughout this thing?
I did not see anyone who clearly fit that bill. They may have been, but I missed them.
Yeah, we did not know.
How about Tsarnaev himself? I mean, I know it's the question we ask every single day. Did he look at any of this?
Nope.
Was there any
engagement?
I didn't
catch any of that.
Nope. The monitor is right in front of him. He's got to be looking at the photographs. He's got to be looking at what everybody else sees, but he has no reaction whatsoever.
So the prosecution rests its case, and we were discussing last week how quickly will the defense start, and the answer was a nanosecond, correct? And they had to follow. I just forgot something. They followed. In addition, one of the final pieces of the prosecution case was a photograph we hadn't seen, correct?
Several photos that were, preceded this horrific recounting of Martin Richard's injuries and sort of amplified the effect because we saw how close Jahar Tsarnaev was to the Richard family.
Can you see right over Martin Richard's left shoulder behind a tree there, literally feet away?
Yeah, and then we actually also saw images that were introduced by this FBI photographer, Michelle Gamble, images of Martin Richard lying on his back, either dead or about to die, an image of Lingji Lu lying with her hands covering her face after the blast went off. Really horrific stuff. And one thing that blew me away today was Miriam Conrad, one of Jahar Tsarnaev's attorneys, undertook this cross-examination of the FBI photographer who introduced these images and also introduced the schematic of the bomb site. And I thought her tone was totally out of keeping with what we had just seen. She sounded very arch. She was going after the FBI photographer saying, hey, so I noticed you didn't put some other people who were standing at the bomb site in that schematic that you just showed us. The implication being that the government was trying to sort of play up the horror of Martin Richard's death. But the problem is his death cannot be exaggerated in terms of its horror. It is as horrific as it possibly
I think the defense was also trying to say that they weren't targeting this family. There was lots of other people around. He didn't know which ones were going to die. He wasn't necessarily targeting a little boy. So that was why she was saying, why did you only...
I know that's what she was trying to do,
defense.
but when you see that picture of Jahar Tsarnaev standing an arm away from Martin Richard, he knew exactly who was going to be harmed by what he was leaving.
Okay, I started asking about the defense. I'm assuming the goal of the defense at this phase, forget the sentencing phase, well, I assume it's going to be the same in the sentencing phase. This suggests the older brother was in charge, the younger brother was just following orders. Did they get anywhere on this today?
No.
It seemed like they were getting somewhere with one of the witnesses. They
With
called
what
the
line of
second witness
questioning?
they called today, who was an expert in cell phone data,
Yeah, it's an
who
ADA
basically
from
was
New
saying
York.
that when the purchases of pressure cookers was made at the Square One Mall in Saugus, when the purchase of BBs was made in New Hampshire, that Jahar Tsarnaev's phone was nowhere near those purchases, the implication being that it was Tamerlan who did it. But on the cross-examination, Alok Chakravarti for the government, I think really ripped that witness, made him seem completely uncredible, made him seem like he didn't know what he was talking about. So I felt like whatever the defense gained, they lost almost immediately.
Well, also, when it follows, arguably the most emotional testimony by what was it, 10 minutes or some such thing
A very
about
short
Martin
period
Richard.
of
It's
time.
pretty hard to move the jury on anything.
It seemed irrelevant because the guy first started testifying about all these tweets he found. He was reading tweets like, better to have sweeter to have sleep after you've had breakfast, so breakfast it is. And he went reading these tweets because they made him sound so innocent. This was after
the bombing.
No, this was actually a year. It took me a second to get this. This was a year before the bombing. So
The
all
tweets were.
the tweets
No,
were.
it was
April
April
actually.
16th.
I thought that as well, but it was actually from a year before, from the previous year's marathon. What they were trying to do, there was a tweet Jahar sent a year before the bombings, which said something like, they will spend their money and they will. I can't remember what it is. Sort of justice will be meted out to these people. The government says he tweeted that in relation to the marathon of a year previous. The defense wanted to say no, he didn't. He was innocuous a year before. He didn't have anything like this on his mind, but they got nowhere. I agree with you.
Any indication whether or not the defendant himself is called to the stand here?
I mean, your next guest, Nancy Gertner, is going to say there's just no way. There's just no way. First of all, there's only one other witness on the docket for tomorrow. Now, if they call him, it's only going to be in the penalty phase, and it's certainly not going to be in this.
The defense should call him because they have nothing. I think he is going to get the death penalty, but I don't think the defense will because I think they're overestimating the.
What do you mean he's going to get the death penalty?
I think that he will be found guilty and that the jury will decide to sentence him to death because, the horror of what he did and what these people went through, the victims, there's almost no way to refute that.
Well, I'm not crying. I don't think I think the conventional wisdom is the jury is going to be out a modest amount of time and find him guilty.
I agree.
But they haven't had an opportunity really to present the defense. I'm not defending them.
No,
Any
they have
mitigating
not.
circumstances. And the
But
assumption
there is
is
no
these people
defense
are
unless
prepared
he
for that, right?
testifies, is what you're saying.
Thank you for
In terms of the
saying
guilt
that.
phase.
Yeah.
And
no, in
it is-
terms of the death
in terms of
penalty
the sentencing,
phase.
it is worth noting, I talked about Miriam Conrad's tone-deaf cross-examination. I think there may have been some frustration on display there because the defense can't make the argument it wants to make about Tamerlan's alleged influence until the sentencing phase. So they may be really, deeply frustrated at the parameters they've had to work with. Them.
But
It still didn't work.
Assuming the case is all about avoiding the death penalty, they will arguably have relatively free reign in the next phase.
We haven't heard it all from Judy Clark yet, and I think everybody's really anxious to hear that because she's going to be the lead person in the
on sparing
penalty
him the
phase.
death penalty. Emily, good to see you.
All right, Jim.
Emily Rooney, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Adam
Jim.
Reilly, appreciate it.